They gave the new nurse the patient no one would touch. Not because they believed she could reach him, but because they wanted everyone watching when she couldn't. When Cecile Norris walked into room 7 that Tuesday morning, half the ward already had their arms crossed and their smiles ready. They stopped smiling 14 minutes later. And for a long time after that, nobody in that building laughed the way they had laughed before. Welcome to Hidden Badges Stories. I'm glad you found your way here. If you stay for stories about quiet people who carry more than anyone around them knows, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. Cecile Norris had been at Jefferson VA Medical Center for 22 days. 22 days of arriving before her shift started. 22 days of staying after it ended. 22 days of hearing charge nurse Rhonda Spears tell the others that the new transfer was slow, overly careful, and soft in the way that people were soft when they hadn't seen enough of the world to know better. She was 34 years old. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a low bun that never quite stayed neat by the end of a shift. Her scrubs were blue. The particular blue of someone who had picked the most unremarkable option available. She moved quietly through the ward, asked before she adjusted anything, and spoke in a measured voice that some of her coworkers read as timidity, and others didn't bother reading at all. She had transferred from a Level I trauma center in Baltimore. Before that, her file had a gap, 3 years where the employment history went quiet, and then resumed as if nothing had happened in between. Nobody asked about the gap. People rarely did when the person seemed uninteresting enough. On the morning of her 22nd day, Rhonda called a brief at the nurse's station. Room 7, she said, tapping her pen once on the desk like a gavel. Staff Sergeant Darius Fenn, Army Ranger, retired, traumatic brain injury from an IED blast admitted after a collapse during a routine follow-up appointment. The ward had tried 3 nurses in 2 days. All 3 had triggered what his chart called an agitation episode. Dr. Brent Caldwell, who had been leaning against the doorframe with his tablet tucked under his arm, looked at Cecile with the particular expression of a man who has already decided an outcome. He said her name the way people said the name of a volunteer. Parker, he caught himself, rechecked. Norris, you have a background in trauma. Yes. Room 7 could use some of that. He smiled in a way that didn't reach any part of his face that mattered. Tyler Boone, the second-year resident, shifted his phone from one hand to the other. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to yet. Rhonda handed Cecile the chart without looking at her. Cecile read it. Darius Fenn, 39. 3 deployments. The blast had been 6 years ago. TBI documented at admission as moderate. But the clinical notes from the last 2 weeks, brief, incomplete, often a single line, described a man who couldn't tolerate fluorescent lighting, who lost words mid-sentence, whose startle response was severe enough that 2 orderlies approaching from either side had brought him out of the bed. One note said combative. Another said non-compliant. A third said patient refuses cooperation. Cecile had seen those words before. She had learned what they usually meant. She closed the chart. She walked to room 7 alone. She stopped outside the door and didn't knock right away. Through the narrow window she watched him. Darius Fenn sat upright against the far wall, not the pillow. His shoulders were broad beneath the hospital gown and his jaw was set tight. The overhead light was on full, the fluorescent hum audible even in the hallway. The bathroom door stood open. The television was off, but the standby light blinked once every 3 seconds. His eyes moved from the window to the door to the ceiling corner to the air vent and back. Not paranoia, architecture. The kind of attention that had once kept him alive and had never been given permission to stop. Cecile reached up and dimmed the hallway light on the panel outside his door. Then she rolled a towel from the linen cart against the gap at the bottom and pressed it into place. The noise from the corridor dropped. Not much. Enough. She knocked twice on the frame, not the door. The frame carried less sound. She kept her hand visible the entire time. Darius's eyes found her hands immediately. She opened the door slowly and stayed in the threshold so he could see the full shape of her before she moved. She kept her body angled slightly away from him. She didn't reach for anything. She said one word, light. He watched her. She pointed to the overhead panel, then to herself, a question in motion. He gave a short nod. She crossed to the panel, dimmed it to 40%, and stepped back to where she'd been. She did not approach the bed. I'm Cecile, she said, slow, one beat between each word. I'm your nurse today. I won't touch you without asking first. His hands were still on the blanket. He didn't move them. But the line across his shoulders dropped a fraction. Low stim, he said. The words came with effort. TBI could do that, not take the words away entirely, but make them require more work to reach the surface. His voice was rough from something older than the injury. You know what this is? Not a question. I've seen it used before, she said. Nobody here uses it. I know. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable. She waited in it without filling it. 3 nurses, he said. I read about that. 2 of them said he stopped, reorganized, said I was the problem. Cecile said nothing. He was watching her face to see if she agreed. Pain's the problem, she said finally. Where? He touched the base of his skull, then moved his fingers toward his left temple. Since this morning. Since yesterday. She noted the blood pressure reading on the monitor. 182/108. She noted the way his jaw tightened when the hallway erupted briefly with a wheeled cart going past. She noted that his grip on the blanket tightened when a medication alarm beeped twice from the next room. When she took his pulse, she used 2 fingers placed at the inside of his wrist, her hand steady, her position to his side rather than directly in front of him. It was a small adjustment, almost nothing. The kind of thing that certain kinds of training made automatic. Darius went still. He looked at the placement of her hand, then at her face. Where did you work before this? He asked. Trauma Center in Baltimore. Before Baltimore. Cecile met his eyes. I'm going to get your pain addressed, that's what today is for. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds, then he looked away. Okay, he said. In the hallway, she found Tyler waiting with his arms crossed and his phone in his pocket. How'd it go? He asked, and the way he phrased it made clear he had expected a different answer entirely. She told him the patient's BP, his reported pain level, the photophobia, the word-finding lapses, the startle response to auditory stimuli. She told him none of it was behavioral in origin. All of it had a physiological cause and all of it was being undertreated. She said she needed Darius's pain protocol reviewed and the TBI accommodation flags updated in his chart. Tyler went to find Dr. Caldwell. Caldwell came back with Tyler and stood outside room 7 without going in. He read the numbers Cecile had written and said, his admission documentation puts him at moderate TBI. Moderate TBI doesn't produce this presentation without a behavioral component. His presentation is consistent with severe TBI, Cecile said. He was evaluated at intake. The intake was 8 months ago. By a neurologist. His notes since admission show progression, not stability. Caldwell's expression didn't change. It was the expression of a man who had learned to hold his face still when he wanted to dismiss someone, without looking like he was dismissing someone. He said he would order a haloperidol protocol for acute agitation. Cecile said quietly, haloperidol will worsen his aphasia. It's contraindicated for TBI-related behavioral dysregulation when pain management hasn't been attempted. Caldwell said that she had been a nurse for 22 days at this facility. Cecile said she wouldn't administer the haloperidol. The hallway went quiet the way. Hallways went quiet when something happened that couldn't be unhappened. Caldwell said he would be speaking to administration. Cecile said, I think that's a good idea. She went back to Darius. He was still in the same position. His BP had climbed to 194/116. His eyes were half closed against the light that was still, to him, too much. His breathing was shallow in the way of someone who had lived with pain long enough to stop expecting relief. How long has it been this bad? She asked. He thought about it. Months, he said, and then, with more effort, they kept telling me adjusting, that my brain was adjusting. Who told you that? Caldwell. She was quiet. I told them I was getting worse, Darius said. They wrote. He stopped, tried again. They wrote that I was improving. Cecile looked at him. Do you have documentation of that, your own? Something moved behind his eyes. He didn't answer right away. In my kit, he said finally, the shaving bag, lining. She didn't reach for it, not yet. She called the rapid response line instead. Dr. Alicia Warren arrived from neurology within 4 minutes. She was 51, with the quick eyes of someone who had spent years looking at things other people had already decided weren't worth looking at. She had been trying to access Darius Fenn's chart for 2 weeks. Twice she had been told his case was managed. Once she had been told a consult wasn't indicated. She had left notes that disappeared from the system without response. She listened to Cecile's report the way someone listened when they recognized the shape of something they had long suspected. Then she examined Darius, properly, slowly, asking before each step, waiting for each answer, while Cecile stood at the door so he had a familiar face in the room. Warren's assessment took 20 minutes. When she came into the hallway, her face carried the careful neutral of someone deciding how to proceed. His documented TBI severity and his current clinical picture don't match, she said, not even close. His records show documented moderate, Cecile said. I think the original assessment was different. Warren looked at her. What makes you think that? He said so. Caldwell came back with Patrick Sims, the facility administrator, and a woman Cecile had seen twice in the hallways without ever learning her role. The woman's badge said patient advocacy. Her shoes were wrong for a building where people spent 12 hours on their feet, soft-soled, dark, barely scuffed, the kind of shoes chosen for reasons other than comfort. Sims said there had been a complaint about a refusal to administer a physician's orders. Cecile said the order was clinically contraindicated. Caldwell said she had no authority to make that determination. Warren said she did actually, and that she had now made it herself. The haloperidol order was rescinded. Sims frowned. The patient advocacy woman hadn't spoken yet. She was watching the door to room 7. Cecile watched her watch it. 20 minutes later, when Sims had taken Caldwell to a conference room, and Warren was reviewing chart records at a terminal, the patient advocacy woman walked toward room 7 with a clipboard. She said she was there to collect the patient's personal items for secure storage, facility policy during extended stays. Cecile stood in front of the door. That's not a standard practice, she said. It is for patients displaying. No, Cecile said, it isn't. A brief silence. The woman smiled the way people smiled when they were recalibrating. Cecile opened the door and said Darius's name. He opened his eyes. Is she authorized to take your belongings? One beat, no. Cecile looked at the woman. That's your answer. The woman left. Her shoes barely made a sound on the tile. Colonel Iris Nakamura arrived at Jefferson VA at 4:17 that afternoon. She had driven from a regional JAG office 2 states over. She was in civilian clothes. She carried a badge that belonged to no department listed in the building directory. She stopped in the hallway outside the nurse's station. She looked at Cecile Norris, standing at the medication cart, with a pen in her hand and a chart open in front of her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Cricket, Nakamura said. The ward went quiet. The particular quiet of a room where everyone has heard something they don't yet understand. Cecile set down the pen, Colonel. Nakamura's expression wasn't surprise. It was the expression of someone who had been looking for something and found it in the last place she checked, which happened to be the right place. How long? Nakamura asked. 6 weeks, Cecile said, this facility and 2 others in the network. Tyler Boone, standing near the printer, looked from Nakamura to Cecile and back. Rhonda, at the desk, had stopped typing. Nakamura said, we need a room. Cecile Norris was, in the language of official documents, sealed for 3 years by order of a federal magistrate, Petty Officer First Class Cecile Ann Norris, United States Navy, Hospital Corpsman, attached to a Marine Raider unit out of Camp Lejeune. Call sign, Cricket. She had been present at a forward operating base in a country whose name still didn't appear in the official account of what happened there. She had kept 2 men breathing with gear improvised from what was on hand, and a 3rd alive long enough to be evacuated. The record of that night was classified at a level that required specific clearance to read. She had been medically separated after a blast injury to her left shoulder. The separation had been structured deliberately to protect her as a witness in an investigation that had been building, quietly, across multiple VA facilities and the contractor networks attached to them. The investigation concerned TBI severity ratings. A government contractor's reimbursement rate was tied to the severity classifications of the veterans they administered. Lower severity, lower cost, lower payout. The gap between what veterans actually presented with and what was being documented had been running across 7 facilities for 4 years. The people who noticed had been told they were wrong. The people who pushed back had been transferred or had their concerns buried in the language of performance reviews. Cecile had recognized the pattern at Jefferson VA in her first week. She hadn't been sent there. She had chosen it herself, then told Nakamura where she was. Nakamura had let her work. Darius Fenn's shaving kit contained a folded printout of his original TBI assessment from the day of the blast. Severe. The word was there plainly in the original document's language. By the time his records reached Jefferson VA's system, that word had become moderate. He had reported the discrepancy 3 months ago, to Caldwell. Caldwell appeared in the contractor's payment records as a consulting physician. His signature appeared on 9 severity reassessments in 18 months, all of them lower than the original documentation. The meeting in the conference room had Caldwell, Sims, Warren, Nakamura, and Cecile. Rhonda sat at the far end. Tyler Boone was in the hallway. There weren't enough chairs, and Nakamura had looked at him once, and he had found a reason to remain in the corridor voluntarily. Caldwell said that Parker, he stopped, corrected himself to Norris, was a probationary employee who had refused physician orders and made allegations she had no standing to make. Warren said she had reviewed 9 charts. She laid them on the table. She said she had never seen 9 consecutive severity downgrades with this consistency across a single attending physician's caseload. Sims looked at the charts, then at the wall above the charts, then at his hands. The door opened. Darius Fenn sat in a wheelchair in the doorway. He had asked a student volunteer to push him from step down, and the volunteer, a 70-year-old retired electrician named Mel, had done it without asking what it was for, because Darius had a look that suggested the answer was important. Nakamura looked at him, Staff Sergeant Fenn. Darius said, "I kept waiting for someone to tell me I was wrong about my own head." He said it slowly, the TBI made it slow, he said it anyway. 3 months ago I put a report in writing, I gave it to Caldwell. He stopped, found the next words. He told me TBI recovery was nonlinear. He told me I was confused about my own records. He looked at Cecile. She came into my room and turned down the lights before I asked her to, before I could ask her to. He looked at the room. That was the first time in 8 months anyone here did that without me having to. He stopped again, pressed on, explain what it felt like to have someone ignore what I was telling them about my own body. Caldwell said, "This patient is currently in an emotional state that..." Nakamura said, "Finish that sentence carefully." Caldwell did not finish it. Sims said quietly, "How did the original documentation get changed?" Nakamura placed a second folder on the table. "That's what we're going to talk about." Caldwell was suspended pending investigation before the end of the day. The patient advocacy woman. Her name appeared on no Jefferson VA staff list. Her badge had been issued through a contractor's visitor system, was detained in the parking structure by federal agents who had been in the building since 2 that afternoon. Sims issued a statement that said very little and promised a review. Warren ordered Darius's full neurological workup, a pain protocol revision, and a case audit going back to his admission. Tyler Boone found Cecile in the supply room at 6:45. He said he'd had his phone out that morning when she walked into Darius's room. He said he had deleted the video. He said it before she could ask, which meant he had been deciding whether to say it all day. "Why are you telling me?" she said. He thought about it. "Because I want to get to the point where I do the right thing without it being hard. I figured I had to start somewhere." Cecile looked at him for a moment. "Keep going," she said. She meant it as encouragement. She meant it as instruction. Both things could be true. Rhonda Spears did not apologize with words. 3 days later, Cecile noticed that the overhead light in the hallway outside room 7 and room 4 and room 11 had been dimmed to 60% during evening hours. A handwritten sticky note on the panel read, "TBI patients nearby. Please maintain." It was in Rhonda's handwriting. Cecile didn't say anything about it. Rhonda didn't say anything about it. That was its own kind of conversation. The policy changes took longer than anyone wanted and shorter than anyone expected. The low stimulation protocol for TBI patients was formalized and added to the admission intake process within 40 days. The chart language, combative, non-compliant, refuses cooperation, was removed as a standalone notation and replaced with a required field asking what the staff had tried before documenting non-compliance. The contractor lost its Jefferson VA contract. 3 other facilities in the network came under review. Darius Fenn's severity rating was corrected. His treatment plan was rebuilt from the ground up. He did not improve overnight because that was not how TBI worked, and everyone around him finally understood that. On the day he was transferred to an inpatient rehabilitation program with a proper TBI unit, he stopped his wheelchair at the nurse's station, the same station where the assignment had been handed to Cecile like a joke, with a punchline everyone had already decided on. He signed something to Cecile in a shorthand she recognized. Not ASL, not formal, just the abbreviated physical language of people who had learned to communicate without noise in places where noise could cost them. She answered in the same language. A brief exchange that nobody else in the station could follow, which was the point. Then he said, aloud slowly, choosing each word, "You came in and turned down the lights. That was the whole thing." Someone finally thought about what the room felt like from where I was standing. Cecile said, "You already knew what was wrong." "Yeah." He looked at the hallway, the ward, the people moving through it. "I just needed someone to say it out loud where other people could hear it." Nakamura, standing near the elevator, had been waiting to escort him to the transport. She looked at Cecile once. It was not a salute. It was quieter than a salute and meant more. The way acknowledgement between people who have been through particular things often skips ceremony entirely. Cecile straightened her badge and went back to her charts. The badge said Cecile Norris, RN. No rank, no call sign, no classified commendations that still required specific clearance to read. It was enough for the work. It had always been enough. The work had just needed a room where someone finally turned down the lights.